So thank you. Welcome to everybody who is attending tonight. It is a beautiful evening, but we are here to just discuss and get more information about something really important, which is the VSB budget. We have a number. We had some submissions that came into us through a form that we had created so that we could get the questions to VSB staff ahead of time. We will be opening up the form again to receive questions over the course of this presentation. It's just a more orderly way to get that information and kind of get it back to me. As we all know, chat in meetings like this can be very, very noisy. So I would like to acknowledge first that we live, work, and play on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to be able to work on their lands. Um, with that, we have a number of guests this evening. So from the VSB, we've provided them our questions in advance. So I'd like to welcome and thank for their attendance VSB Secretary Treasurer David Crean, Assistant Secretary Treasurer Shazad Somji, and we also should have Will. I didn't check your last name pronunciation, I'm sorry, but Will Shu, Manager of Budgeting, Forecasting, and Planning. Uh, hopefully I got that correct. Um, Hopefully I got that correct. And they're here just to, provide any details on those questions that we have provided in advance. But again, we are taking questions in the form. Let's see. If in the chat, if you have submitted a question via our form, if you could just say that you have submitted a question in the chat by just indicating a queue so that we know to go look for it, that would be much appreciated. I would also like to note that this meeting is being live streamed, or it's widely available, and we will be actually recording it and placing it on our website just to provide parents that weren't able to be here some of the information. We took the questions ahead of time. We grouped and summarized the questions, and we will keep the chat open to hear concerns and feedback, but we do have a link that will go to the forum where we would ask you to submit your questions. And with that, I would go to our first group of questions. There were a number of in the survey that we provided for questions. We provided some snapshots from some of the presentations that the VSB has made recently with regards to the budget. And I mean, I don't know whether how we would like to start, David. If you'd like to, go through these slides, or whether you could give us a plain language explanation of kind of big picture of how we got to be here, because I think that a lot of people are, um, we're aware that VSB is not the only district facing this pressure, and I think there's a lot of questions as to what's happening, why all of this now, and so I think some of that explanation would be really useful to parents, in addition to talking about the VSB process. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and you tell me where you want to start. We've got these 3 slides with regards to the budgets, balanced budget approach, assumptions, and risks. And then we have the first question with regards to explaining what a status quo budget is. But if you have something bigger picture you'd like to share, please feel free.
Okay, thank you very much, Gord. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from the traditional unceded lands of the Sayout, Sakem, and Pakwachin First Nations on Vancouver Island, and happy to live in their lands. So I guess we're still in a pandemic, and I guess when we developed the first draft of this budget, and the overall sort of objective of it was to try to continue to provide the same level of service for next year that we had this year, recognizing that this year we had a lot of extra expenses related to the pandemic, for which we were graciously and thankfully supplied with federal and provincial grants to cover those costs. So we tried to, you know, get back to a place where we look at, you know, we try to get back to a place where while we consider to be a normal year, and we're making some assumptions into next year, what might be a normal school year. I think the biggest assumption we have is that we will be, you know, back to, you know, full in-class face-to-face instruction. So I think that's a that's a key one right now. I think that I think we all need to recognize that the district has, you know, there's a structural deficit in our budget. And we've been fortunate to be able to generate or realize surpluses over the last few years that have been able to help us, you know, mitigate the fact that we have that structural deficit. And, you know, structural deficit comes about from various and sundry things like you know, expenses for which we don't get extra funding for. So for example, if there's increases in, like, say, you know, next year there's increases in WorkSafe BC premiums, for example, we don't get any extra funding to cover that. You know, over the years, we didn't get any funding for wage lifts for principals and vice principals or excluded staff. So those are sorts of expenses that contribute to, you know, a structural deficit. So we need to have keep that in mind as we go forward, because we're trying to get to a place where we actually will do like a three-year budget plan, and we haven't been able to get to that place yet. But you know, we're working towards that goal. So if you just go back one slide, Gord, what was the first slide? Yeah, okay. So we try to take this balanced budget approach where, you know, we look at our strategic plan, but we also have to recognize that, you know, a draft status quo budget means that any decisions we make going forward have to be in the context of that balanced budget position. So if we add something to the budget, we need to take something away to maintain that balanced budget position. So I'm going to go to the assumptions. So these are the major assumptions. School age enrollment projections, 8,535, a slight increase from the current year. The International Student Program, this was presented on March 29th as 1,100. I think if we're waiting on numbers from the International Student Department. I think it may be actually a little bit higher than that. We have a modified summer school program for this summer. And as I said earlier, we have, you know, in-class instruction for all students face-to-face. On the revenue side, we're not projecting any change to rental rates. We're not increasing rental rates, but we are assuming that community rentals in schools will start again in September. The interest rate on the money that we have deposited with the central deposit program with the Ministry of Finance has further declined to by 0.5% down to 0.95% now. So you see the impact of the pandemic and other factors there, where before the pandemic, we were getting 2.95% interest, and now we're down to 0.95% interest. We're also assuming cafeterias will be open in September. And on the expense side, we budgeted for inflation to be 1%. Utilities go up by 3.6%. Teacher and support staff wage lifts up by 2%. No budget increase for exempt staff in the budget. We have WorkSafe and benefit premium increases, anti-racism training costs. And we've assumed the average teacher salary cost is going to be $87,000. So the next slide. Okay, so some risks that we've identified going forward, and some of the questions later will address some of these. any further enrollment decline in the ISP program, would result in a reduction in funding, which should only be partially offset by reduced staffing and departmental costs. Average teacher salary cost, may be higher than what's projected. Another one would be that, students who opt for distance learning, even though we're assuming face-to-face kids back in schools, some students, with the pandemic still lingering, may choose to still stay with distance learning rather than go back to class. And for each one of those students who does that, we lose $1,565 of funding. The difference between distance learning funding or an in-school funding. And then, of course, we have to be aware that, COVID-19 protocols will continue. We'll have to have enhanced cleaning, personal protective equipment requirements, and we won't have any funding for that. At least to this point, we haven't been informed of any funding to cover any of those costs. So, when it comes to the COVID money that we got this year, we've had some meetings. We keep revising the budgets that we have for that so that we can, if it looks like we're not going to spend the money in certain areas that were originally laid out to be spent, we have, we're planning to buy more masks. We're planning to stock up on cleaning materials and those sorts of things, so that we have things on hand, so that when kids go back to school, we'll have some extra supplies to help deal with some of the protocols that we have to deal with.
Can I
Okay,
can I
next.
can I ask a question? I mean, I'm not sure I fully wrapped my head around the idea of what a structural deficit is. I mean, what I heard from you is there are, what I heard from you was that there are expenses that are increasing, that are not, and those, and again, such as WorkSafe. Um, uh, there are expenses that are increasing that we are not fully funded for. Is that basically, the is that the essence of the structural deficit, that there are expenses that are that the government, that the provincial government simply is not
If
doing
we're
in our
trying,
operating grant?
we're
Yeah.
trying to continue to supply the same level of service, then yeah, if there's expenses that we have to incur that we don't get extra funding for, then that contributes to a structural deficit.
And our understanding of the way the operating grant increased. I mean, again, there was some obvious, in our minds, some clawback of other grants, but in the headline where it says the operating grant has increased by 4.3%. But is it the case then that the operating grant increase does not quite cover all the other increases, like the increases that are required? So, for example, salaries have have a negotiated increase, and it looks to me like we're kind of falling behind, because the operating grant hasn't. You have to look at it really carefully, but the operating grant isn't really keeping pace with with the salaries. Is that basically an accurate statement, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
We're gonna. That's one of the questions later on. We can address it then. But I mean, it's you're pretty right on that. Like if we don't get funding for all of the wage lifts that we have, then that also contributes to the structural deficit.
Okay. And when you say that we've run surpluses in the past, can you provide an example of? Can you provide me an example of, like, what kind of things would be in the surplus that we're kind of, it feels, when I looked at the line items, it kind of felt like here is spending that we intended to do over like 5 years, and we're pulling some of that into today. But that's maybe a misunderstanding of what those surpluses look like. And it'd be good to know what goes into those, like like how is it that we actually have those surpluses both last year and this year to draw on? And if that's something that you're going to be able to address later on, why don't you address it at that time? But it's a question about like,
Yeah,
you know, why? Yeah. Okay.
we can address that at the time, okay?
Okay. So uh,
Carry on.
moving on through this, moving on then through the slides. The first one, you know, we looked at the three slides that you had presented before, and we've got explain what a status quo budget is. And I think you've
Jack, you
touched
want
on
to take this one?
yeah.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Thanks, David. So really, status quo budget really reflects the fact that we're providing the same level of service and level, and really the adjustments are based on enrollment. So staffing would be adjusted based on enrollment. You know, funding is also enrollment driven. So we're making some assumptions that funding is going to be based on the 48,535 enrollment number that we submitted back in February. You know, and any one-time costs or savings that are realized this year are eliminated as well from next year's budget. So, you know, some of the things like one-time costs are if the board, I guess last year the board said, well, you know, we're going to put additional funding towards cafeteria replacement, equipment replacement. So if that's a one-time item, that would come out of this year's, or sorry, next year's budget forecast.
So sorry, is that an example of something is clawed back into a surplus?
No, it's not clawed back into surplus. It's just not factored into the budget for next year. So
I think the key to understanding the difference between budget and surplus is budgets are always balanced. Like we have to have a balanced budget. So the original budget is balanced, the amended budget is balanced, everything else. Surpluses arise in the actual accounts when we don't have when there is, say, more funding than we had budgeted for, or less expenses than we had budgeted for, then that will create a surplus in the actual results, not in the budgeted results. I think that's important to understand.
So again, just, you know, going back to the idea of, and I know it's not this slide. So as you've said, what you put in the budget itself is balanced. But for example, last year you reached that by pulling on a surplus, and this year that is what you intended to do as well. So is it so are you looking to balance the 20, like right now we said for the 2022 budget, which you need to balance, you're looking at a surplus, pulling a surplus from this year, the actuals from this year, the 2021 year. Is that correct? Have I got that right?
Actually, well, yes, but some of it also is from the from previous years too. So it'd be from 2019, 2020 also. But yeah, prior year surpluses.
Gord, I think, you know, one way to look at the surplus is, you know, especially if you're in private industry or private business, your accumulated surplus is really like retained earnings in the private world, right? So you're going to have a net income at the end of the year, hopefully, and not a net deficit. But your net income is really what we call a surplus for the current year. And then your net income in private industry would go into your retained earnings, sort of like your piggy bank. And that's what our accumulated surplus is. It's our piggy bank to use in future years.
And is it the case? I mean, and there's a little bit, it just feels like with this budget, we're drawing down on that piggy bank more than we have, or with what's been proposed, we're drawing down on it more than we have in the past. And that's because we can normally expect some things that are, you know, there's a normal amount that you have that you don't end up spending out of the budget. That's, you know, whatever a normal amount on a $500 million budget is. But this year it's a little bit more pronounced because of those additional costs.
And the fact that we're not cutting anything, We're trying to keep the same level of service. What's the next slide, Gord?
Okay, the next slide. Well, this is exactly the same question, and it would be really
Right.
useful. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, you just said it yourself. I mean, we projected $8.9 million surplus to balance the 2020-21 budget, and now we presented something on March 29th that would require $14.9 million surplus appropriation. But when we present again on Thursday night of this week, those numbers will change. So, but some of the additional costs, which I already mentioned, things like WorkSafe BC premiums, anti-racism training, reinstatement of COVID savings. So we had some savings in the budget due to COVID that have now been put back into place. For example, the transportation of our special needs students. We had an arrangement with our First Student busing company that we would guarantee them a minimum ridership so that they could stay in business. And anything, we charge the actual ridership to our regular account, but we charge the excess, which was the actual ridership was always less than what we had guaranteed. So the excess got charged to COVID because it was
Right.
a COVID-related cost and it was extra cleaning costs and everything else. So we that was just an example of reinstating some of the COVID savings. Also, then, I mentioned earlier about the lower ISP enrollment. We're down about 600 or 700 students from 2 years ago. And the investment income reduction in interest rates has all contributed to that deficit. And you're right, Gord. I mean, we're relying more and more on surplus to balance the budget. And that's something that's something that has to come to an end at some point in time, because surplus is only one-time money and it can't be spent for other things. Next slide.
And so with this slide, I mean, this is a question about what other districts are seeing. I think it would be really good for people to get some sort of flavor of what Vancouver looks like compared to some of the other districts. Where we're more vulnerable, where we may have seen more cost pressures, or more cost pressures or revenue loss. I mean, it just really helps put it in context for us, because we are seeing that quite a number of the large districts are having issues, right? And so I assume they're all related, but maybe we're uniquely vulnerable in some way.
Well, I mean, in these two examples here, the ISP and the interest rate, I mean, these are both factors that other districts would also have incurred. The ISP to different levels of, depending on the level of enrollment, the impact would have been different between districts. And again, the impact on the interest rate reduction would have been different based on the cash balances that we would have invested in the CDP program. Shazad, what about other thoughts there? Like, you sit on some of the meetings with the other lower mainland districts about what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I think the the revenue challenge that Gord mentioned with the 4.3% increase in funding, and the fact that the ministry's rolled in a couple of the special purpose funds from last year into the operating grant this year. Districts are facing the same sort of pressures that we're facing as well, and that there is some feeling out there that there is some underfunding going on with the ministry, and that it's not covering the full costs of some of the wage lifts or the ability to balance your budget. So most districts, I would say, are using surplus to balance their budgets. Staffing challenges is not staffing challenges, but staffing levels. So for example, um, you know, our district has higher numbers as far as non-enrolling teachers go. And, you know, that's not a surprise. That's something that we've had for a number of years. And, you know, other districts wouldn't have that same cost pressure because, you know, they're running at the line of what their minimum ratio should be. So those are sort of, I guess, some of the discrepancies between districts, but there's also some similarities.
Is work and one that we mentioned from time to time, and I just wanted to verify, is WorkSafe, those is it EHT premiums that are specific to larger districts? I mean, the metro districts are probably going to all get hit by them, but like a smaller district doesn't have to pay those premiums. Is that correct? Or
There's a basic fee for the sector that all districts have to be responsible for, but then the rest of it depends on, there's a component that depends on your actual experience in WorkSafe claims. So it would be different from different districts, but most of it is based on a basic charge. Basic level of fee, and that went up quite significantly this year.
So that's so what I'm hearing is that's a cost pressure that that's a cost pressure, structural deficit that everybody would see, although different districts would be impacted in a different way depending on their previous claims history. Is that what I'm hearing? Like,
Yeah, that's correct, Gord.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll move on to the next slide then.
I noticed there's lots of questions in the chat or comments. We can get to those later, I guess, right?
Yeah, I know that Amanda's gonna try to summarize and feed some to me. I know there's a lot and I cannot possibly keep track of them all. So I'm relying on Amanda to tell me what I need to send me a direct message and say, do this. Sorry, Amanda. Yes, and there's this piece, which I'm sure will get press, and I would love to hear a little, I mean, yeah, I'm sure this will
Yeah,
get
she
press.
said you just started to speak to this one, so you can take this one.
Yeah. So, you know, just going off of your sort of question there, Gord, that, you know, there was a 4.3% increase in operating grant. But the fact that, you know, the ministry rolled in a couple of the special purpose funds into the operating grant nets out to about a 1.5% increase. So, you know, the things that, as David mentioned, so the ministry is supposed to, or does, fund wage lifts for teachers and education assistants. It's the sort of the exempt staff, the principals, vice principals, and other exempt staff where the wage lifts aren't funded in there. So, you know, that would contribute to sort of your structural deficit as well. You know, I would say the metro districts have done a bit of an analysis, and, you know, we indicate there that our initial calculations show there's about a shortfall of about $1 million. I would say probably 75% of the other metro districts are in the same position as Vancouver, in that there is a shortfall, but the other 25% have seen that there is sufficient funding that they received this year.
I'm just smiling because it's not a great, I mean, it's a very complicated answer, right? I mean, it really, what I'm hearing is it's really difficult to tell exactly if everything is being covered and it's hard to generalize over districts. What I'm hearing is it kind of depends on, just as you said, it depends on choices that have been made that have been indicated with regards to staff composition to some extent, and it impacts districts differently depending on that staff composition. They've all done a calculation, but it's a little bit, it's difficult to compare, but many of the metro districts are in similar situation. and about maybe half the districts, you said 25 districts, are probably, they have different staffing compositions and they're not as badly affected by these changes.
I
Yeah,
know,
sorry,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just saying, not 25 districts, 25% of metro districts.
Oh, okay,
So
25% of,
right. So, we've looked at it, compare, we meet with the metro districts on a regular basis, and I would say 75% of those, just the metro districts, the 10 or 12 districts that we sort of communicate with on a monthly basis, they're feeling that, a shortfall, whereas the other 25% are seeing sufficient funding.
I see Vic asked a question in the chat about if the ministry advertises a 4.3% funding increase, but as Shazad stated, it's really 1.5%, then what will the BSB do? There's not much the BSB can do, Vic. Seriously, because if you recall last year's budget process, the ministry also rolled into the block the employer health tax refund, and also the carbon tax refund was rolled into the block last year. And this year they've rolled in all the wage increases. So it makes it very difficult to analyze. So when we do this calculation to say, oh, it looks like we could be $1 million short. Well, there's a whole bunch of assumptions in that calculation that, not every district is doing it the same way, because some districts actually came out and said, oh yeah, we got more money than what we should have got. So that doesn't, what it means to me is that, there's not a consistent way of analyzing that shortfall.
it's just,
And then
right.
the second part of the question is, how sure is the BSB that the ministry funding is finalized if their budget is not yet finalized? Well, I think that the ministry's announcement for operating grants on March the 12th was the final number for 2022. I should say that there's an amount of money in this year's budget, 2021, of about $37 million that the ministry has yet to allocate to the system. And in previous years, that would have been called a holdback, and it would have just been allocated to school districts based on enrollment. What I understand now is going to happen is that money will be allocated somehow, but it'll have rules around it. So I have some suspicion that it might have something to do with, providing a buffer for COVID protocol costs that might have to be incurred. But without the ministry telling us what that is, then I don't know. I can't speculate beyond that.
One of our ongoing communication challenges is, one of the things that DPAC will point out on a regular basis is, it is entirely possible and this has happened historically, and you don't have to say it, we can say it, but ministers of education in the past have said, we are funding the system more than we ever have before. And that statement can be true. And still districts can be losing out and having to cut things. And, both of those statements can be true, because not the increases haven't fully accounted for the cost pressures that have already been, built into the system. So it's just, when we ask about this 4.3% increase and what it works out to, really, I mean, that's us trying to understand and cut through the top line announcement that it's a 4.3% increase. What we're seeing both at Vancouver and other districts is clearly it's not great news, and we're just trying to understand partly what's led us here, because I think that's really important, because I think that lets parents talk about what level of government we need to talk about. But I mean, I think the trustees have some hard decisions. I know they've asked to see a little bit more detail about the line by line budget. So I mean, that's I mean, it's trustees have to guide, and there's staff have work to do, but it's helpful for us to understand the big picture about how we got here, and it really seems quite sudden, to tell you the truth. I mean, for a number of years that we've worked together, you yourself and I, David. I mean, it's been, most of the talk has been, small surpluses, status quo budgets. Pretty close to, every year has been pretty close to the same, and this is the first year, in my history, not others, that we've had to discuss something of this nature. So it's just really good to get more information for us.
Yeah. What's next?
One of your assumptions and risks was the average cost of a teacher, and I think that might have something to do with enrolling and non-enrolling teachers, but I'm not sure.
Well, that's true. Enrolling, not a lot of non-enrolling teachers get paid more money than enrolling teachers, but also the length of time that teachers are teaching. I mean, there's a scale. So the teachers at the higher end will get more, they get paid more money. And the other example here is that we always make an assumption about the average, about the number of teachers who will retire. And the assumption we make is that teachers who retire are probably teachers at the higher end of the pay scale, having served their tenure as teachers and probably put in their 30 years or whatever, 30, 35 years. And they're going to be replaced with newer teachers who are going to come in at the lower salary levels. So if fewer teachers retire than what we assume, because they don't have to give their retirement notices until usually after the budget is approved, then that could increase the average cost.
Does Vancouver tend to, again, just asking about differences between ourselves and other districts, does Vancouver tend to have longer tenured teachers than other metro districts? You can't change anything about that. It's just of maybe of interest to people. Is our average cost of a teacher higher than neighboring districts?
We'd have to get back to you on that. Unless, Will, do you have anything on that, or we get back to DPAC on that one? Can we get some information?
One way to look at it. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Will.
For me, one way to look at it is look at our what's it called, salary differential funding compared to other districts. Yeah, because that shows what the ministry thinks our average is compared to other districts on average, and then we'll get funded for the difference. We'll only try to fund it for the difference.
Try to fund for the difference. We can put that to you in writing and get back to us later. I mean, it's just, again, we're just trying to understand what those risks are and understand what those assumptions mean, right? Because we know that salary is a huge part of your fixed costs, or more or less fixed costs, basically, right? So we're just kind of trying to understand.
And Trustee Barrett has corrected me that non-enrolling teachers and enrolling teachers get paid the same, depending on where they are on the scale, which is true. I think what I was trying to say was that I think, and perhaps Trustee Parrott can correct me again, but perhaps I was thinking that like teachers like speech language pathologists and school psychologists, those sorts of people who, I think some of those people get paid more.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Trustee Parrott, for your comment in the chat, just bringing people's attention. And I assume this is, from your anecdotal observations that we have an older teaching force. And again, I guess, that is an observation from Trustee Parrott from, I guess, her years of experience. So thank you. Just moving on to the next slide. And again,
Board,
yeah,
it's not the first time that Trustee Parrott has corrected me, but I always welcome the correction.
thank you, Trustee Parrott. Thank you, David.
So what's this one? Shazad,
Yeah. So of the risks you mentioned, which is the biggest, which is the biggest risk to the overall budget?
Yeah, so, we've highlighted some of the risks here, and, we've talked about the international student program enrollment and the tuition impact that would have. Our tuition is $15,500 per student annually. So you can, you could calculate the difference there. The fact that pre-pandemic, we were probably upwards of 1,800 students enrolled in the international student program. And we're now we're projecting a number of around 1,100. So, you're losing 700 students at $15,000 each, which adds up quite significantly to the budget for the district. The average teacher cost is another one. As we just talked about some of the assumptions we make as far as retirement, the new teachers coming on. But with 3,000 teachers, $100 outage one way or the other has a $300,000 impact to the district. And lastly, the example we're using is the distributed learning, and the fact that if students opt to choose distance learning versus in-class learning, there is a bit of a funding difference of $1,500 that would be adjusted out of the ministry grants coming our way. So, these are some of the ones that, I guess the larger ones that we've identified. I'm sure that we'll probably come across a few more as we go through the budget process for the next few weeks. But I would say these are probably the largest ones that we have impacting the district.
So just and just trying to understand that. The international students, right? That 700 students difference between, say, 2 years ago and what we're projecting for next year, right? That's more or less 10 million minus 10. That's a $10 million difference minus staff costs, right? Which,
Correct.
Say 30. Well, say 30 staff, but still there are staff costs, but still it's a fairly, it's the, of those three that are on there right now, it's probably the most significant hit. Unless of course, if we didn't have that many, we like DL, distributed learning. We had a lot of people go to DL, but not even 1,000. Was that right?
I don't have the number. I don't know, Will, if you remember the number going to DL?
I think,
No.
well, I think it's clear that the international student is probably the
It's
most,
yeah.
it's the most significant one, and the other ones will add up if sufficient numbers of students do opt to go to distributed learning. One of the things that DPAC is asking for advocacy on at the provincial level, so that's BCCPAC, is we're asking for advocacy that funding for something like an option 4, or funding for students that wish to remain connected to their classes be maintained in a manner similar to it is this year. So that's an advocacy piece. It's something that we'd love to see the ministry do. Not sure that will happen, but it's something that we think is important. Um, moving just moving on through. So the next section is about kind of balancing the budget. And this is one of your slides, just a snippet from your slide. So it'll be using unrestricted accumulated surplus to balance 2021, 2022. Projected deficit is 14.9, and surplus is available as 10.6, and we're going to need to find 4 million in savings. And so here's the projected surplus available for use. And sorry.
Yeah, so this is going to change on Thursday night when you see the presentation on Thursday night, because we're now I think we're now in a position to say that the projected surplus for this year is going to be higher than this 1.6 million, because we've now received the February recount from the ministry.
Okay.
So this will change on Thursday night. But let's go on and talk about it.
Okay. Well, can we, so just going back to this, the question about, the idea of, what's in a surplus, what it, so this is from last year, right? What are operations spanning future school years? Because I mean, it's one of the largest items there.
Well, included in that number, the $14.5 million, is the $8.9 million we set aside to balance the budget. So that's the major chunk of that money. There is a slide later on about what other things might be in there. So it could be things like if we have a project that we know we're going to spend money over the next 2 or 3 years, we would set that money aside and say we spend so much next year, so much the year after, so much the year after that. Also, at the end of any given year, there's always purchase commitments that need to be completed. So that would be something that we would restrict into the following year.
Okay. If there's, I may ask questions again, and if you do have something about this surplus coming up, but I do see, because I still don't, I mean, I get the idea that that's what the 8.9 million here is. It's something that it was previously said, we're going to use this to balance the budget. That's why it's no longer available, but I still don't. And I think you've given a couple of examples of things that, like, projects that have money committed into the future that would say we've not chosen not to do, that might account for some operations spanning future school years, but it's still not perfectly clear to me. But let's go on to the next slide, and maybe we'll see more information on the surplus in those. Oh, exactly.
So the unrestricted accumulated surplus. So it's first of all, it's basically that it's not restricted, and it's basically after we restrict everything else, it's the end result of the spending that didn't take place during the year.
So let's say, again, I'm just trying to get a handle on what might be might be in it. So it could be like we decided to do a study on say the SLL program, which we did, but something like that, and it didn't happen. So that money goes into the so previously committed budget items that we didn't spend on, that goes into the unrestricted surplus. Is that like, I mean,
I think the best thing to do is to review our policy 19.
okay.
Because it lays out the parameters on which we would restrict certain things. We would restrict things for operations spanning future years. We would restrict something for an unanticipated or anticipated unusual expenses, or things that are constraints on funds like donations and things like that. Those things get restricted. And then the policy calls for a certain amount, certain percentage of these to be set aside as a contingency reserve. Everything else then in the surplus is then called unrestricted accumulated surplus. So you have to really go through all the other sections first and then get to the place of this is what's unrestricted.
So policy 19 would speak to what could go in there and what would be unrestricted.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you I know I'm asking a lot of questions that aren't here, but I really am trying to just help all of us understand better what's going on this year, especially compared to past years. I haven't really felt the need to delve as deeply before, because they've been better news.
Okay.
Okay, and here's, I did ask that question.
Yeah. So I think I just
So,
explained that a little bit, Gord. I
right.
mean, the example there is
So,
the student technology was funded for 3 years. Right?
so does that mean when we say we're pulling something out, I just want to go back to the slide. Does, so, oh, here's the surplus operation spanning future school years. Okay, so that's just there. It's not what's actually being, it's not what's actually being used to balance the, it's not what's actually being used to balance the budget, right? It's, or it's
No,
just part of the surplus, but it's not being used because it's actually already committed to other things. Is that
that's
right?
correct.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. So again, it's not, we're using, okay, so again, we're using a number of like one-time expenditures, things that are like we put into a contingency that no longer need, but we're not, so that's not a stable source of funding, but we're not like canceling projects and saying we're not yet at the point of saying, hey, we committed to something for 5 years, but forget it, we're canceling it, and we're only doing 1 year or 2 years of it because we're taking from the future. We're not there yet, but I mean, again, that's not to say never.
But
It's just
that,
that's
but that could happen.
right. I'm just I'm just saying that hasn't happened. That's not what's been outlined here when we say, when we in the surplus you've said operations spanning future years. You're just telling us about what's been committed into the future. You're not saying
No,
that we're canceling. Okay,
that's right.
thank you.
What's next?
Technology surplus. We were under the impression that most of the technology this year would have been covered, and most technology purchases this year would have been covered by uh, federal funding. So we're just trying to
No,
understand what wouldn't have been.
this was a 3-year deal we did in 2019 for replacing obsolete student technology.
Okay, so it's something that has been spent over the course of a few years, and it was an ongoing thing started a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, just if I could ask a question just about, well, okay, I'm going to get to this next slide here, but I do have one other question in this section. It might be related. Yes. So what did the funding for North Hamburg enrollment pressures go to? Yes. And your response here is that is a possible renovations to elementary schools or portables, but that's for 2021, 2022.
Yeah. And that decision, any decisions on spending that money have not been made yet. So if we decide not to spend that money, we don't need to spend that money, that would just fall back into the surplus.
Okay. And my recollection is, I mean, I'm not sure what the solutions are, but I know that, we're continuing to have enrollment. If I recall correctly, we're continuing to have enrollment pressures. Uh, uh, we're continuing to have enrollment pressures in that area, if I recall correctly. Are these cap? Yes, and Peter's with Hamber, and he agrees fully. Are there? I mean, are these capital? Are these considered like a portable? Is that considered a capital asset? Like, I mean, is it weird purchasing it from an operating fund, or just trying to understand how that breaks down?
Well, we often have to fund small capital purchases from the operating fund because we don't have large balances of local capital.
Okay, so uh,
And we don't have
so
large balances of local capital because if you were part of the meeting we had earlier tonight about the Fleming south side of the Fleming site, then you know, we try to propose things where we generate some capital revenue where things don't have to get funded out of the operating budget.
I was not in that previous meeting, although I know that I I can say that, you know, we've definitely had as an exec, we've had some interesting debates and discussions. We do have a position on, we do have a position with regards to, you know, land sales, but it is definitely an interesting debate that, you know, that we bring that our exec bring a number of opinions to.
Well, let me
So,
give
Mhm.
you a perspective, Gord. Okay.
Mhm.
A
Okay.
portable, to buy a portable and install it in Vancouver costs about $250,000 because it has to be engineered, it has to have a foundation, it has to have sprinkler systems and everything else. Okay.
Mhm.
So $250,000 would fund it out of the operating budget, means that in order to balance the budget, we don't have the opportunity to staff 2.5 more teachers or 4 SSAs. Okay. But because it's a one-time purchase of an asset,
Mhm.
if we had the money in local capital, we could just pay for it there and not use the operating fund at all. So that's a perspective that I think people need to understand.
I, again, I know that uh, the I certainly have had conversations with you about where I want the district to be, and certainly I have a different perspective. You know, a number of us have different perspectives on land sales. That's all, and other revenue opportunities, and that's all I can say there. And I think I should move on before I say something that I'm not supposed to say because I'm speaking on behalf of the exec.
Okay.
Okay, so just moving on to further questions. I think we're past most of the main sections about, you know, what we've got here and what we might do to balance. Um, I do have some general questions, and for those trustees that are here, and I'm sorry, trustees, if I did not acknowledge you when I saw your names. I apologize. I do know that Trustee Parrott is here, and I believe Trustee Fraser is here. If there are any other trustees here, welcome. Thank you for attending. Really do appreciate it. Um, we do have, so we have some general questions coming up, and we did have a number of items that weren't questions at all and simply feedback that we intended for staff and trustees. So those are some of the slides a little bit further on. Okay, so this was just a general question.
These questions, right?
Yeah, these are just general questions about, well, how much money does the VSB save by closing for a week of spring break? I think all the other, but one thing I would note, I know that parents have asked whether this is a, whether this, whether this additional week is a useful change. But I would also mention that, you know, we try to coordinate with other metro districts as well, and so I think it would not work well for one district to be an outlier as far as number of days off around spring break. Um, and if I could get somebody just to speak to this, this was a series of questions about targeted funding, and I know there's not a lot of targeted funding in the budget in our revenue. So maybe I could get somebody to just speak to this set of funding and speak about other funding that might be targeted in general and how it differs.
Is that?
Yeah. So I guess that this targeted funding for Indigenous students is, you know, as we state there, the district gets $1,565 per student. That's part of the operating block that the ministry announced. And so, you know, if you look at the if you remember from March 29th there, when we presented the operating grant rate changes and the different funding amounts that were coming out, some of the other sort of targeted funding, I guess you could say, are the supplemental funding for students with special needs, right? So on top of the basic allocation that districts receive, districts also receive an additional supplemental amount for students with special needs, depending on their category. So that funding would also be targeted towards providing services to those students. There's also, for example, English language learners. There's some funding there, so $1,585 per ELL student. So that funding would also be used to provide additional services to ELL students. So as far as how it's spent at the district level, it really comes into the district department, and then the district department looks at where the supports and what kind of services are required throughout the district at each school site. And
we also have all the special purpose funds that are not in the operating budget. They're also all targeted for certain things too, like the school classroom enhancement fund, community link, strong start, those sorts of funds.
Yeah,
they're all part of the budget, but not part of the operating fund.
But so a question. This question was about targeted funding for Indigenous students, and we know that there's additional funding for, say, special needs. And so what I'm reading from this answer here is that the funding for the Indigenous students is rolled up at the district level, and it's delivered by the district. And the district is going to make its efforts to make sure that those rolled up supports hopefully go to the schools where those students are, but they're also spreading it out around to everywhere else as well. I mean, and is that a good summary of of how those funds are being used by the district, and is that how it works for special needs as well? Because I mean, one thing I've heard is the special needs funding, it's this additional per student, but some parents say, well, we're not really seeing it. And so I'm just trying to understand at the very least, what the philosophy is behind those types of fundings. Again, is it, and just to summarize what I heard here, this funding is rolled up to the district level and then trickled down. Is that what's happening with, say, funding for special needs children?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
And then it gets allocated to the schools. And I think the misconception is, or the misunderstanding is, it doesn't get allocated to a particular student. It gets allocated to the school for supporting all the special needs students. So, it's been my experience that lots of parents will feel that, my child is not getting the support they need because they don't have a full-time SSA or something like that. But, there has to be left up to the school as to, how those allocations, how that staffing is actually allocated in the school.
Okay, just moving on to, and so this was just kind of a group of questions about funding, and so thank you for that information about special needs funding.
Yeah, I apologize, Gordon, on this one. I didn't quite understand the context of this question. So
I think I probably picked it up verbatim. I think, from my point, and I probably looked at it a little bit. I mean, really, I guess the question to put to you, if you've got, say, South Fleming, for example, I mean, really, are there any other, what other opportunities are there other than selling the land or leasing the land where a school exists? What other choices do you have?
in terms of capital funds?
Yeah, I think so.
I guess that's what I'm missing. Is this a question about capital funds, generating capital revenue?
Uh, why don't we interpret it that way? If you would have an answer for that.
I think the only other way that we could, like in our capital fund, we do have some, leases that are capital leases. So we could negotiate new rental or new lease rates on those, right?
Mhm.
But other than that, I mean, to generate capital revenue, we could, I suppose you could do, I don't know, you could do an exchange with another school district or something, or exchange with the city or something. It's difficult to answer that question.
No, that's fine. I just thought I'd put it before you. Um, it's I think parents are. I know that our one of our motions is fairly restrictive with regards to land sales. So again, that's a motion from our exec.
Okay.
Okay, and is the VSB and this was so this. Well, I'll let you speak to that, please.
I guess I didn't quite understand the context of this one here, the existing commercial land use. And my first statement here is not quite right. I mean, I do know that we do have some land that is zoned, parts of some properties may be zoned commercial. Anyway, so the district can dispose of land, but bound by Board Policy 20, which allows only for the sale of partial sites and not whole sites. And at the end of that policy is the board motion from 2015 that talks about maintaining or increasing current number of school sites, reserve neighborhood sites for current and future education community use. But that would not preclude land swaps or the sale of portions of school sites, provided that education programs can still be offered. So I didn't understand the context of commercial use land, but yeah, the district has the ability to sell land, and for those of you who are at the Fleming South Side information session earlier tonight, the district is also has on its books a motion to not look at fee simple sales of land, but rather to look at leasing. Which was, explained in the Fleming session earlier that, leasing in Vancouver, long-term leasing in Vancouver is the preferred and regular way to go when it comes to disposal of a piece of land.
Thank you. I have again, I'm having Amanda tell me what questions I should bring up, and one has come from Trustee Parrott, which I would just love to bring forward, and maybe Trustee Parrott, you may need to elaborate. I'll ask the question, but there may be some context required. And the question is, uh, can referenda be used for capital funds?
Yes, with the approval of the ministry, there is a clause in the School Act that allows for referendums, school districts to run referendums, but you have to have the authority of the school district or the minister to do that. And I don't recall one having been done in a long time. Not since I've been in the system, and I don't recall. I guess I probably researched this sometime in the past. My understanding is it's been several years since the referendum was actually approved by the ministry.
Thank you.
But Trustee Parrott is correct. It is permissible.
Thank you, David. I think we may have received some other questions through the forum, so I'm going to see what Amanda brings forward to me. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot, Amanda. I do have a number of slides that are just, feedback, feedback from parents that I culled out of the questions because they were more comments. I think they're useful for trustees and staff in attendance. I'm just going to flip through them now. I divided the feedback into some um,
Okay.
I divided the feedback into some general sections, and you would have seen this. I mean, feedback regarding cost savings and revenues. Um, and again, these are suggestions that came through the forum. These are not something that the exec or that we've discussed as a group, but just some ideas with regards to
Mhm.
fees, fee increases, subleases of buildings,
Yeah.
and evaluation of some programs. I think the comment about spending less on travel conferences. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I think that's an easy one. I think especially with our experience this year.
Yeah. We are looking at that, Gord. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
What we'll do with these, Gord, like we're going to present on Thursday night, committee of the whole, so we can bring, we can bring some feedback from this meeting tonight to that meeting, and so the other stakeholders can hear the concerns of parents or the suggestions of parents, and some of these things the board may direct us to do some more work on, and ways to find savings. But the one we are definitely looking at travel and conference fees.
hang on. Okay, and so just I have found a thread with the questions that have been posed through the meeting, and I have to go back to that thread. I was looking in the wrong place, but I will keep going through the feedback first, and just some areas I think just areas requiring additional funds, and knowing that it's that's hardly the discussion we're having, but I mean these are comments from parents,
Mhm.
and um, and I think there's a lot of validity to the idea of well, especially mental health supports.
Yeah.
It has been a very tough year for families, and I don't know exactly what next year is going to look like, but I think students will be really overjoyed when all this is over. But I mean, some of them may need quite a lot of support. I would also say, especially special needs students, there I definitely get the sense that I mean there's a constant issue with some staff with resource being used resource being used to support unfilled absences. But I think I get the sense that it was more pronounced this year, or certainly I'm anecdotally hearing more about that. And so again, supports for those special needs next year, anything more we can do, especially given what we had happen this year. Again, this is general feedback from parents.
Okay.
Um, and the other thing is, and to trustees in attendance and staff, I mean, I think there was a general recognition that that the school system, we want the school system to actually not just do the minimum, we want it to do more. And I think it's a constant on the list. So for trustees listening in, that we would like to see more from senior levels of government. It seems bizarre that this year of all years, multiple districts would be facing shortfalls, and having to use the word structural deficits in their presentations to the public. Um, and it's not. I mean, the VSB obviously gets to butt head with the provincial government a lot, but I mean, really, in this case, it's not just us. So it really isn't just us. We're not even the worst hit. So it would be really good to lend our voice to any advocacy at the provincial level for to make this right. I just want to so with that, I've gone through the slides. I do have a number of other questions that have been posed in chat, and I would like to just an opportunity to run through them for a few of them, if I may. David, Jason,
Yeah.
thank you. Um, so under previous provincial governments, music programs were cut across the board at the VSB. And we know that there is some planning with regards to a music program that's been discussed at a number of student learning and well-being meetings, I believe. is there a plan of return for funding for music? Return of the band and strings programs, for example, that used to be at schools?
Tomorrow night at the Student Learning Wellbeing Committee meeting, there will be a update on the music review that was done. And it does contain some recommendations. But the recommendations in that review are basically, I think they're planned out over 2 or 3 years or 3 or 4 years. So right now there's nothing in consideration in the budget to reinstate the band and strings program for 2021, 2022. But there is a report coming tomorrow night at Student Learning Wellbeing Committee, which does have some recommendations in it.
Okay. And just the next question is more with regards to special needs. I mean, it's a comment that over years that the funding for special needs students has been cut, both in previous governments and this government has acknowledged previous cuts, but has not actually restored those supports. And I guess the question is, you know, how can we do more? How can we put more in the budget? How will this budget be able to put back what was those supports that were taken from those special needs children?
We we're not contemplating adding anything to the budget for special needs students other than to provide the supports that we provide based on the enrollment that we have and the needs that those students have. So that's how we have to go about it. It would require a much more detailed analysis to go back and examine what might have been cut in the past and what we would have to do to reinstate some of those costs. And I do know that, you know, we have increased costs in certain areas over the last, 3 or 4 years. I know that we have, our staffing of SSAs has increased. We also now have to the point where we have a number of SSAs who are have permanent contracts and all they do is fill vacancies when other SSAs are ill or can't come to work. So we're doing what we can, but it's basically trying to, keep it going the way that that we have it this year and try to make the same staffing levels next year.
Has the VSB ever or has the board ever considered a direct donation campaign to the parents and community? Something, and I've got the comment is, I envision hopefully matching funds from the Ministry of Education and tax receipts, etc. So is, asking for a direct donation campaign something that the board has ever considered?
We have the ability to issue tax receipts now for donations. So, Suzanne, you want to explain how that works in the schools?
Yeah,
Well,
I think Pat DPAC's familiar with the donation process we have. I think maybe to speak a little bit to Gord's question, I don't think we've done a direct sort of campaign, donation campaign, but with the new position of our manager of business development, he is applying for grants and looking for specific types of funding that would support the district's needs. And so I guess, this year alone, he's brought in, close to $700,000 in funding that the district probably would not have received otherwise, because it didn't have a dedicated person looking for those specific types of grants. So, I think as that position develops and grows, that's probably the type of funding that we would go after, rather than sort of like a matching donation campaign, because I don't anticipate the ministry is going to be on board to match, the public's donations coming into school districts.
Okay. When is the absolute, what's the deadline for the VSB submitting a budget? Does the ministry have to formally allow an extension? So what's your absolute deadline?
June 30th.
June 30th.
That was a very definite answer. Got it. And that's something that's gone through 3 readings and is approved, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Just a question about the interest rate change and how it impacts the operating budgets. I mean, when we think of some monies that the VSB has set aside in accounts earning interest, we think of things like Cole Harbor, for example, monies that have been put aside for the future Cole Harbor, right? But aren't those, is that capital money? And then how does the interest rate impact the operating budget? So we're a little bit confused as to how that works, if you know what I mean. Like that's capital funds. So where's that interest going?
We have 2 different funds in the central deposit program with the Ministry of Finance. One is the funds related to the BC Hydro project, which is for the Cole Harbor School and a future school at Lord Roberts Annex. That's a separate fund. And then the other fund we have is our regular operating cash balances that, go up and down, and we will put money in there when we have excess cash on hand, and we'll take it out when we need it. But the interest rate applies to both funds. It's the same interest rate.
Okay, so the interest rate applies to both funds, but one of those funds is related. I mean, the one that you would have reported on with changes in the operating budget is the fund that's not the one for Lord Roberts, right?
That's right.
It's okay. Okay, that makes sense. This is one of those questions that's assumes an answer, but I'm gonna ask it. Okay, so has any consideration been made? Has any budget consideration, and the trustees feel free to pipe in, but have any budget considerations been made for those supports that might be needed should the SLO program be terminated? So we note that a number of programs run by student liaison officers are not actually are not programs that need to be run by law enforcement. So, but it's a dangerously convenient source of a program. And so has any allocation or thought been put to how we might replace those programs with monies that do not come from the police?
No, we have not made any consideration for that. Mainly because the board has yet to make a formal decision on the SLO program, and if they did vote to terminate it, then that would involve another conversation about if we want to put in other programs or how they would be supported and that sort of thing. But we don't have any consideration for that at this point in time.
No, thank you, David. That's fair. It's more or less the answer I expected, but I did feel the need to ask the question. Shazad, you mentioned the business manager, like the funds and the grants that they were going after. Is that somewhere? Is that work and the results of that work somewhere in the draft budget?
Well, there's a line item, in the budget coming, I believe it's under other revenue, Will, or miscellaneous revenue. That's there. We don't get into the detail of it, but there was a report done at the February Finance Committee where there was an update on the grants that they brought in up to December 31st, I believe, and then there'll be another update probably at the June meeting, just summarizing, the funding that we were successful or not successful in receiving based on the applications that we made.
So the next update would be at the which finance? Sorry.
Probably at the June Finance Committee.
June Finance Committee. Okay, thank you. With that, I think I am done the questions in the slides and the questions that we've received through the forum. I know I have asked you many questions that, for my understanding, to better understand my understanding of the terms that are being used. It's been really helpful and enlightening. And I know it's useful for us to understand what's driving the changes. It's a very difficult conversation that a number of districts are having to have, and it's actually quite concerning, to tell you the truth. And I'm hopeful that if enough parents and enough boards speak up to the ministry, that they'll reconsider, because it's certainly it's not just us, and so I'm hopeful that makes a difference. So with that, I think I would like to thank you very much. And for anybody else, if you do have questions, I am happy to for later. I am happy to try to get answers at another time. But at this time, it's 8:30. I'd like to thank the staff very much for their time, and wish you all a good evening.
Hey,
Thanks so much, Gordon.